Welcome to the Cognitive Edge, where we examine the issues that affect teaching, um, learning, library technology, libraries in general, and the future of education. Um, Today, I want to discuss a difficult question, one that many teachers, parents, special educators, and school leaders um, have probably wrestled with at some point if you haven't already. Um, and that question is can the academic intervention service process sometimes take too long for students who actually have learning disabilities, whereby leaving a growth gap? Um, uh, and, if it does, what happens while we're waiting? As I was saying, does the learning gap continue to grow? This is not an argument against AIS at all. Academic intervention services can be extremely valuable. Many students struggle academically at different points in their education without having a disability. Some need additional instruction, some need more practice, some miss information or foundational concepts, and some just need material presented differently. Um, this is kind of how it goes. AIS can catch those students before a small problem becomes a large one, but there's another side to this conversation as well. What happens when a child doesn't simply need just extra help? What happens when the child has an actual learning disability? Um, that's where the difference between intervention and delay become extremely important. Um, Imagine a second grade student who's struggling significantly with reading. The student has difficulty decoding words. Um, Reading is slow and it's very laborious to do. Spelling is difficult. The child avoids reading aloud. Teachers recognize the problem and provide additional intervention. That is exactly what should happen. The students enter academic intervention services. For several months, additional reading instruction is provided. But the student makes very little progress. A lot of times you won't see a lot of progress. So another intervention is tried. Another few months pass by now. So now we're going into our 6 month. Time's passing. The student still struggles. The school decides to continue monitoring, just to monitor. Um, Third grade arrives. It arrives quickly. It arrives rapidly. The student remains in intervention. Then someone says, maybe we should give it a little more time. And that sentence, give it more time, is where we need to become very careful, extremely careful. Because time is not educationally neutral. Okay. Time does not play in our favor in education. Um, while we are waiting, the curriculum does not wait. The other students, they keep reading, they become more fluent. Um, they encounter more vocabulary. They um, read science, and they are reading their social studies, and They enjoy reading novels, and they like to solve word problems. Um, they begin using reading not simply as a subject they are learning, but as a tool for learning everything else. Um, Meanwhile, the struggling student may still be using enormous amounts of mental effort simply trying to recognize the words on the page. Um, the results can become a widening academic gap. Um, and that gap may no longer be limited to just to reading. It continues to grow out. It can begin affecting writing, um, vocabulary, um, comprehension, you know, background knowledge, um, science, social studies, the core skills, I guess we'll call them. Uh, and reading is a major part of everything. It helps boost uh, a student's confidence in their ability to want to do work because they can now read. It's one of the most important things educators need to understand about learning disabilities. Academic difficulties, they're often interconnected. A reading problem in second grade can eventually become a much larger educational problem because reading becomes increasingly important as students move through school. Um, you know, there's an old expression in education that during the early years, students are often learning to read, while later they're increasingly reading to learn. And that is true. That transition matters. And if a child enters that transition without strong foundational reading skills, almost every subject can become harder. And they become harder and harder. So the question should not simply be just, you know, how long has this child received AIS? The better question really is to ask, what have we learned from the child's response to the intervention? Um, this is a very different way of thinking. It really is. It's a different way of thinking and going about things. Um, AIS should not simply be a place where struggling students remain. Uh, AIS should really be generating information. Um, we should be looking at progress, and we should look at the student's response to the AIS, how quickly the student is picking things up, what kind of instruction are working, what kind are not. Um, is progress significant enough to close the gap? Has it really reached its cut? Or is the student simply maintaining the, the distance behind classmates? Um, the last question it's extremely important. in kind of a way. Suppose a student improves their reading skills during intervention. That sounds, extremely encouraging. And uh, but the question is what if everyone else is improving at the same rate or faster? The struggling student may technically be making progress while still falling further behind academically. Progress alone is not always enough. We need to really look at the rate of the progress. Are interventions actually changing the student's trajectory? If they aren't, continuing the same approach, indefinitely makes very little sense. At some point, I believe we need to have to ask whether something deeper may be occurring. Um, could the student have other problems? Could there be a language based learning disability? Um, could there be difficulties that involve processing speed or working memory or written expression, mathematics, or um, any other area? Um, could attention, hearing, vision, language development, or another factor be affecting learning? Yeah, those questions, they really require evaluation. And this is where an important misconception sometimes appears in schools. Some people may believe that students must finish AIS or RIT before they can be considered for special education. Um, that should not be the way we think about the process. Um, Intervention and evaluation are not necessarily two completely separate stages. Um, a student can receive intervention while the school is also considering whether a disability may exist. Um, if there is reasonable evidence that a student may have a disability, um, the question should not become, have we tried every possible intervention? That, you know, probably shouldn't be the question that we jump to, because we could theoretically continue, trying interventions forever. The question that really should become: do we have enough evidence to suspect that the child may need a comprehensive evaluation? Um, this is an important distinction, and parents should understand it as as well, basically. Um, Sometimes families hear things like, we want to give the intervention more time, and so um, you know or we want to collect more data, or uh, we want to try another instructional strategy first. um, these statements, they're not automatically wrong. um, Good intervention requires data, definitely 100%, But parents and educators should also ask, um, how much data do we need before the data is already telling us um, something, So, if a student is repeatedly demonstrating significant difficulty despite quality instruction and targeted intervention, continued lack of um, progress itself is, meaningful information. We should not wait until a child is dramatically behind before deciding that something needs to be investigated. Um, think about this probably from another point of view. Imagine a student who is struggling academically by 6 months, and then the school waits another 6 months. Now, the student may be, say, a year behind. Um, Suppose another school year passes before an evaluation is completed and appropriate support is implemented. Um, Now we're not simply trying to teach the student new material. We're trying to teach the student new material while also repairing missing foundational skills from previous years. So we're kind of playing catch up and make up. Um, and doing that becomes much harder for our children. The educational system sometimes unintentionally creates a situation where students must fail badly enough before they qualify for more intensive help. That is exactly the mindset we should change and challenge. Students should not have to prove that they can fail for a long period of time before we take their difficulties seriously. Early intervention matters because learning builds on previous learning. Reading fluency supports comprehension, and number sense supports later mathematics. Vocabulary, we know, supports comprehension. Writing skills depend partly on language development, spelling, organization, and background knowledge. Um, when foundational skills are weak, advanced skills become harder to develop. Um, this is why early identification matters so much. It's so important. But I also want to be careful here. Not every struggling student has a learning disability. Okay. We should not automatically refer every child receiving AIS to special ed. Um, that would create, I think, its own problems. Children develop at different rates, really. So students, they um, they need temporary support to get themselves started. And then others need changes in instruction, and others may be affected by attendance or language development or familial circumstances or school transition or gaps in previous instruction. Um, that is precisely why intervention systems really they exist. Um, so the goal should not be to move students into special education as quickly as possible. The goal should be to identify the right support as quickly as reasonably possible. Um, those are two very different things. Special education is not simply more help. It is individualized instruction and services designed around a disability that affect educational performance. AIS and special education serve different purposes. They both are two different processes, but there should definitely be communication between those systems. Um, Teachers providing AIS should be sharing data with classroom teachers. That's just so important. Um, Classroom teachers should be documenting patterns. Special educators should be available for consultation. School psychologists should be examining emerging concerns that may be appearing or starting to exist. Families should understand what interventions are being provided, and everyone should be asking whether the student is improving or is the student not. This cannot simply become paperwork because behind every data point is a child. Um, a child who knows that other students are reading faster, or a child who sees classmates finishing assignments, um, and a child who may start thinking, maybe I'm just not smart. That psychological part of academic struggle should not be ignored. Students notice academic differences much easier and much earlier than adults sometimes realize. Repeated difficulty can lead to much frustration. Um, Avoidance, really just behavioral problems, um, you know, a heavy onset of anxiety, a loss of motivation you'll get. Students, they um, begin protecting themselves by pretending that they don't care. Child who refuses to read aloud may not be lazy. Um, the child who jokes during independent reading may not simply be disruptive. The student who says, "This is stupid," may actually be saying, "I don't want everyone to know that I can do this." That is another reason why speed matters. Early support is not simply about academic achievement. Um, it's also about protecting a student's relationship with learning. We want to see, um, ultimately, we want children to see difficulty as something that can be addressed, not as evidence that they are incapable, um, but so let them know that they can do it. And what can you do to help them understand they can do it? Um, First, use AIS aggressively and effectively. Intervention should really be targeted. It should be evidence based. It should be delivered consistently, and progress should really be measured frequently. Um, Second, establish clear decision points. I would say schools should not allow students to remain indefinitely in an intervention cycle simply just because everyone is uncomfortable making the next decision. Um, Really, after a reasonable period of intervention, teams should start to really examine the evidence. Um, is the student closing this gap? Is the student improving enough? Do we need to intensify intervention? Um, do we need additional assessment? Do we suspect a disability? And third, communicate, honestly with families and with those who you work with who are in the need to know. You know, Parents, they should know everything or exactly where their child is performing. And that's academically, not simply your child is receiving AIS. Um, that's completely ridiculous and not enough. Tell them what that means, what skill is being targeted, um, how often is intervention occurring, what data is being collected, what progress is being made. Um, where is the student compared with expected grade level performance? And what happens next if the student does not improve? These conversations, they should happen early. Um, Fourth, avoid the wait to fail mentality. We should never celebrate the fact that a student has been struggling for 2 years because we finally have enough evidence to act, on a particular program. That's not really success um, whatsoever in my mind. The better system identifies warning signs early, it responds quickly, monitors carefully, and escalates support when necessary. Um, and fifth, remember that referral for evaluation does not automatically mean placement in special education. Evaluation means we are gathering more information. Uh, we should not be afraid of information. You know, if the evaluation shows that the student does not have a disability, that information still helps us understand the student. If the evaluation does identify a disability, we can begin designing appropriate support. Either way, we know more than we did before. Ultimately, this conversation comes down to one question. How long should a student struggle before we decide that ordinary intervention may not be enough? You know, um, it's difficult, and there's no single number that applies to every child, but there should be one guiding principle. Um, and that guiding principle should be intervention should never become an excuse for inaction. AIS should really help us discover what students need. It should not become a waiting room where children remain while academic gaps continue to grow. It really, because when we talk about 6 months or a year in education, we are not simply talking about time. This is not just time. We're talking about thousands of words a student could have read, hundreds of concepts they could have practiced, dozens of books they could have explored, and even lessons they could have understood, lessons they could have been exposed to, confidence they could have developed. There was a lot here that we sort of missed, and opportunities they may never get back in exactly the same way. The purpose of intervention is not simply to say that we provided support. The purpose is really to change the student's educational trajectory and what we, in the best situation. And when the intervention isn't doing that, we need to be willing to ask why. This is where good education begins. Not within defending a process, not with checking a box, or but with looking at the child in front of us and asking, what does this student need, and how quickly can we respond? Can we responsibly provide it? I am sorry. What does this student need, and how quickly can we responsibly provide it? Because sometimes the biggest danger is not moving too quickly. Sometimes the biggest danger is waiting too long. I'm Dr. Daniel A. Sabol, and this is The Cognitive Edge, where we challenge the systems, assumptions, and practices shaping our educational system, and we ask how we can make learning work better for every student. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep looking beyond the process to the student the process is supposed to serve. All right, talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.